Okay, this morning we're going to talk about parallels in geography. Not parallels in geography, but parallels and geography. And the reason is I couldn't think of a better title than this, because that kind of summarizes a couple of the main points that I want to make when I get into talking a little bit about Israel and the U.S. and political situations that are going on. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about today involves geography, and geography is very important in Bible prophecy. And we'll see how that works. So you'll see that those themes kind of come out a little bit, I hope, as we go through. We talk each week, as we say, about the convergence of events and the fact that the world is in a very tumultuous state. There are a lot of things going on that show that certainly seems like it's the end times because of all the things happening and multiple things happening and all these different tracks that we see, lines of thought or things that are going to happen in Bible prophecy. They're all happening at once. And my view is that they all converge at a point, that point being the second coming of Jesus Christ. But as they get closer to that point, everything gets closer together, and it almost is like the vortex of a tornado. Everything's going to be very tumultuous. And if you think it's tumultuous now, all I can say is just wait. You haven't seen anything yet. So we're going to talk about that today. So first we'll talk just about some general things that are going on. This was an interesting article in Wall Street Journal the other day about 5G. I don't know if you've heard about 5G coming. It's about 100 times faster than 4G. They're putting in all these cell phone towers, and there's a big fight between the US and China over who's going to control the technology. And I can say you don't really want China controlling the technology, but they seem to have the upper hand right now, and they're rolling things out. They're pushing it in a lot of other countries other than the United States. And we know we have the problems with China with the social credit system that I've mentioned, that millions of people in China now cannot buy a high-speed rail ticket or an airplane ticket because their social credit score is not high enough. They may have criticized the government. They may have posted something anti-government on a Facebook page at one point. And as a result, they're essentially under at least a regional arrest, detention, because they can't go places. And we know China's also doing with the Uyghurs. They're persecuting these Muslim groups in Western China. Now, it may be that there's a valid reason that some of these people are arrested and detained because there is a lot of terrorism in that community. That's a Muslim community. But now I've also heard that the Chinese are also going after the Kazakhs from Kazakhstan that might have immigrated into China, and they're also Muslim. They're also being detained. And China's putting in place, just like communist governments do, they put in place these people to spy on other people. They're in the community. And the result is there's at least 1 million Uyghurs, from what everybody estimates, in detention camps, concentration camps, re-education camps, they call them, in Western China. And these have been established by satellite photos and that type of thing. So you don't really want China in control of this 5G, but this 5G will make the internet, high-speed internet, kind of ubiquitous. It'll be everywhere. And it's going to change things. It's going to change healthcare and all sorts of things. I mean, I was recently in for some surgery, and I have a healthcare app on my phone, and I get updates all the time from every time my chart gets updated or a new bill gets posted. That's the ones, the bill always comes through. Sometimes the chart updates are a little bit behind, but the bills are always there. And it pops up on my phone. I get a notification and all that stuff. But when 5G rolls out, this is going to happen even more quickly, and this is going to give people everywhere a lot of access to the internet. Now, there's an article here, Microsoft, and the title of it is, this is on a Microsoft Windows Central sponsored website. It's written by a guy named Ward, I think Jason Ward is his name. It's called a Warditorial. You can see down here the little logo in the bottom left-hand corner. But the title of the article is Microsoft, the ID 2020 Alliance, Universal Digital Identification and You. And it's talking about the fact that Microsoft and other companies are working together to develop digital IDs for everybody in the world. Now, it started with all the refugees and trying to track refugees and that sort of thing. So there's always a good purpose behind this. We're losing track of these people, where are they at? But look at what it says here in the first part of the article. Our digital activity increasingly parallels our real-world activity. Participation in the modern economy, the ability to buy and sell, attain employment, healthcare, social services, and more are virtually impossible without a digital identity. Now, I only highlighted the thing buy and sell because we always talk about, is this the mark of the beast? Is this what's going to be put in place by the Antichrist? And, because it says nobody will be able to buy and sell without this mark. And the real answer to that is we don't really know exactly what this mark is, if it's a physical mark or an implant or something like that. There's a lot of speculation on it. So everybody runs wild with speculation. And remember, years ago, it was the barcode was 666 mark of the beast. And everybody was going to have a barcode. And there are times, I have to admit to you, that it'd be nice to have, something that's just like, just scan this so I don't have to fill out all that paperwork every place I go. So I've always said, if this is what it is, when it comes, it'll be a good idea and everybody will willingly accept it. But the thing that's important about it is, at least in terms of Bible prophecy, is when it's tied to, if it is a physical thing, it's really the spiritual aspect that I think is much more important, that you will pledge loyalty to the Antichrist. And that is what has eternal consequences, and that is what you need to worry about and avoid. So we don't know, but it's just interesting when people are talking about these things that Bible prophecy people talk about, secular people talk about them, and they use a lot of the same terminology that's in the prophetic scriptures. One of the big stories this week was what happened with United Methodist Church. United Methodist Church had a special conference in St. Louis, and one of the main things on the agenda was they were going to vote on a resolution. It was put out by, I believe it's called the Wesleyan Cooperative Alliance, to because the United Methodist Church has been going in a very liberal direction theologically, getting away from biblical foundations. But there are people within the United Methodist Church that want to hold fast to biblical principles. Now, there's a lot of issues in the United Methodist Church, and this is sort of an indicator of where things have gone, where the United Methodist Church has gone theologically. I mean, I know churches that have left the United Methodist Church, and they do it at great cost, because when you're in the United Methodist denomination, the denomination has a trust deed over your property, so that if your church leaves the denomination, and this is true in Nazarene and other denominations, the building, even though it's that local congregation that spent all the money to buy it, develop it, keep it, maintain it, the title of the building reverts to the denomination. So when churches leave a denomination like the United Methodist Church, it comes at great financial cost. So the Wesleyans wanted to bring the church, at least try to bring it back on this issue, same-sex marriage and gay clergy. So they put in a resolution, and there were several different plans that were proposed. There was the one church plan, which meant every church could decide what they wanted to do. And there was I think it was called the open church plan, which meant sort of anything goes. And then there was the traditional plan, which, no bishop or UMC pastor could perform same-sex wedding, and you couldn't be an open homosexual and be ordained. And if it was found out that you had done this, performed a same-sex wedding, or that you were openly homosexual, living as a homosexual, you would lose your ordination. So they voted on it. It really came down to the one church plan and the traditional plan. And the traditional plan passed by a vote of 53% in favor and 46% against. Now, the reason that it passed was the U.S. congregations, representatives that were at this conference in St. Louis supported the open church plan, or the one church or open church plan, by a margin of about 2-1. About 2/3 of them would have voted for against the traditional plan and for the one church plan. But the United Methodist Church is not just local, it's also includes, it's growing in Africa, and they're much more conservative. And they hold to traditional marriage much more so in Africa than we do here in America. And so it was really the African church, and it was in Philippine representatives there, that caused the vote to be 53% to 46%. But the thing that's troubling is that it was that close. And it was the headlines, these were front page headlines from Kansas City. This is the one in the bottom here, profound disappointment. That's from the Tampa Bay Times. This was an editorial in the upper right-hand corner in the Washington Post the other day. A church turns its back on gay clergy. And you see the sign here at the Allendale United Methodist Church in Florida: "For harm done by the church, we are sorry." Obviously, you know where the pastor of that church stood. Adam Hamilton, who's the pastor of Church of the Resurrection in Kansas City. It's a huge church. I think they run around 13 to 15,000 on Sundays. It's the largest United Methodist church in the United States. And he's very pro same-sex marriage. Very, very, very pro same-sex marriage. I've played clips of him speaking about the issue before, and he was very upset. He gave interviews. "I just can't believe we did this." And he has essentially said that his church is going to leave the denomination. Now, does that mean that what's going to happen to this? They have a huge building in Overland Park, Kansas. Is that building going to revert back to the denomination? And they also, because people were threatening to leave the church, they also put in a resolution that, well, if you do that, we'll protect your pension and that type of thing. So always got to get the financial thing taken care of, so that your stand that you take doesn't really cost you financially. You may have to leave the church, but at least you get your pension. This is a church. This is a blog post from pastor, Cathedral of the Rockies in Colorado. "In the wake of our denomination's general conference, let me say to all our LGBTQAI," and the AI is not artificial intelligence, by the way, folks. And I think he left off some of the letters that I've seen in other reiterations of this. "Families, allies, and members, I, Pastor Wayne, repent for the unbiblical witness of our institutional denomination. You matter to God and to me. You are made in the sacred image of God. Our institutional denomination could not fully live into the love, grace, and mercy that Jesus offers to all. Our institutional body has seldom led at the general conference level with the Holy Spirit. Took a civil war to end slavery in the Southern Methodist Church." And he goes on and cites a couple of other examples. So, he would clearly be in the church that's going to leave. Now, the interesting thing is that the supporters of this wanting to allow same-sex marriage and gay clergy into the United Methodist Church said that the people that voted for the traditional plan, which is based on something that we call the Bible, were divisive and schismatic. Now, this is a very common thing that has come up in the modern evangelical church. And I'll give you this example. And a lot of you know this here because I've talked about it previously. The fact that you disagree with someone in a church does not make you divisive from a biblical standpoint. One of the biggest examples of this was James MacDonald, a pastor at Harvest Bible Chapel in Illinois. This is the front page of the Chicago Tribune a couple weeks ago. He was fired for a lot of reasons. There were a lot of allegations of abuse and that type of thing. A lot of people were surprised, but if you'd been paying attention to what was going on at Harvest Bible Chapel, you should not have been surprised what happened to James MacDonald. The problems were apparent many years ago. Now I'm going to play you a clip of him speaking to the Harvest Bible Chapel Pastors and Leaders Conference. Everybody has a big conference. And he was talking about a passage of scripture that he thinks is very important. I want you to listen very carefully. He will cite it. It's Titus chapter 3, verse 10. And then I'll explain to you why he was wrong. But it was, when I heard this, I knew there's going to be problems at Harvest Bible Chapel in the future because he is, well, let's listen to him and then we'll talk about how his statement matches up with scripture. So here he is speaking. And I'm going to guess this was about 2012 Pastors and Leaders Conference at Harvest Bible Chapel in the suburbs of Chicago.
I secretly wish that these two verses were my elders' favorite verses. They're not my life verse, but I wish that my elders had these two verses for their favorites. One's from the pastoral epistles, where it says, reject a factious man after the second admonition. I wish that that was my elder's life verse. How much heartache is caused in a church by elders that forbear for the sake of friendship with a factious man. Reject a factious man after the second admonition. Now, reject him doesn't mean he has to sit halfway back. Okay? Reject him means you can't come here anymore. Well, I'm sorry. Okay, that means you get to go to a different church. Reject. Do I need to spell that out? Why? That's so cold. It's so wise. How much heartache I could have saved our church over the last 2 decades if I had lowered my expectation of my ability to change the behavior of others and raised my expectation that people will be as they have been. A factious man is a danger to the church, and you are released by Scripture to release him. And I'm releasing you to take a small portion of your church's budget, build a catapult, put it in the church parking lot, and load it regularly. I think we can shoot this one right out of our county. All right?
Now, personally, I find that disgusting. Because it's not, because what's become in the church growth movement and leadership network and that type of thing is that if you disagree with any change in the church, you're divisive. And therefore, under Titus 3:10, you are to be kicked out of the church. This is what the passage he was citing was, reject the factious man after a first and second warning. And I've seen churches that require elders to say, we'll never disagree publicly with another elder, and that sort of thing. And included in that is disagreement over proper interpretation of Scripture. And so anything that you disagree with the leader, like James MacDonald, and it was clear this became his life verse. And people were drummed out of that church simply because they questioned, hey, why does the church have $70 million in debt? Why does the pastor get a new house with a mortgage of $100,000 a year and he gets a $100,000 a year raise? And so these questions were asked, and so this passage was said, as he said, put him on a catapult and launch him out of there. But he's misinterpreting Scripture. In Titus, the King James Version actually does better than, he quoted the NASB, the New American Standard, but the King James actually does a better job of sticking to the biblical text in this particular case. It says, a man that is what? A heretic after the first and second admonition reject. That's based on the Greek word heretikos that's there. Heretic, it's where we get the word heretic. That's how you would see it in sort of a phonetic spelling. Yes, thank you. I know the Greek, but I don't know phonetic. So it's based in part, the same concept, although the word heretic is not used there, also comes up in Romans chapter 16, verse 17, which talks about what is it that's causing division that you have to really avoid and get rid of people over. It's not disagreeing or questioning, like, why did you borrow $70 million? And by the way, I think that church at one time had 82 or 42 million, $82 million in debt. One church. That's a lot of debt. And now Pastor McDonald is gone and the church has that huge debt. Now I beseech you, Romans 16:17 says, now I beseech you, brethren, mark them which cause divisions and offenses, but it's not divisions and offenses where you disagree with me. It's divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine which you have learned. And that never entered into James McDonald's talk about this particular subject. And so I do believe, having watched that, having friends involved in that movement and church, that reject the factious man, his interpretation became his operating principle and his life verse. And you see it. That's what he told all the pastors and leaders of the Harvest Bible Chapel Fellowship. This is what you need to do. And now we see the result 6-7 years later. He's gone. Why? What happened? He twisted the passage to suit his own needs. So that's sort of a governing principle here at church. At Fellowship Bible Chapel, we do understand how that verse is to be interpreted. And so, we disagree over things, but doctrinal stuff is different. And it's when people depart from the doctrines of the faith that you need to be careful and you need to admonish others. Now, there are certain theological issues that I think are open to debate. Believe me. Eschatology and future things, they haven't happened yet, so they're not facts yet. We have a pretty good idea how things are going to work out, but you got to be careful not to go crazy. So there are lines that I draw in that particular area, but that's another discussion. So here's another thing that's going on in our culture. Federalist, Canadian court rules parents can't stop a 14-year-old from taking trans hormones. This happened in British Columbia. 14-year-old girl. On Wednesday, the Supreme Court of British Columbia, Canada, ordered that a 14-year-old girl receive testosterone injections without parental consent. It was pretty bad. They issued a court decision. Look at what this is actually I lifted this directly out of the court decision. attempting to persuade AB, this is this girl who wants to be a boy, to abandon treatment for gender dysphoria, addressing AB by his birth name. And the court made very clear early on in the opinion that she wants to be called he, so we're going to use male pronouns. Referring to AB as a girl or with female pronouns, whether to him directly or to third parties, shall be considered to be family violence under the Canadian statute. So I'm thinking of the admonition of Jesus, and he says, when you see the abomination of desolation, stand in the holy place, get out of town. Matthew chapter 24. And maybe we need to sort of, does that apply to Canada? Get out of Canada. This is so disturbing. As Dennis Prager said on his show the other day, the left destroys everything that it touches. Listen to this. AB is permitted to apply to change his legal name from that on his birth certificate to his chosen name, and the consent of his mother or father for such change is not required. AB is permitted to apply to change his gender pursuant to the Vital Statistics Acts without the consent of mother or father. And there's a gender change clinic at this hospital near where this school district is in British Columbia. And so they're playing God and taking the place of the parents. And I listened to Dennis Prager Friday, and I thought he made a very good point. One of the most important commandments, he said, and he wrote a book on Exodus recently. And look, he's not a Christian, so always keep that in mind. But he said, but I think he does have some wisdom. And he said, one of the most important commandments is honor your father and mother. And he said, that just doesn't apply to the kid. It applies to society respecting the mother and father of a child that they have brought into the world. I thought it was a very wise point. And so they want to do this. I don't know if you saw the articles. I don't even have. This week, there was a Colorado boy who refused to wrestle a girl and was disqualified from the state tournament. And he just said, I don't think I should be in close quarters like that with a girl. And look, I wrestled in high school and college. I know that it's pretty much a contact sport. Almost more so than any other sport, because you're entwined with these guys sometimes, other guys. And so I'm grateful for this kid standing up for what's true and right, and I think he has great parents that taught him the right thing. In track and field, I don't forget what state it is, transgender, boys who now claim to be girls finished, I think Connecticut, first and second they finished in some indoor track and field championships. There's a NCAA lower division guy who ran track as a guy for 3 years. Now he's running as a female, and he's, as they say, he's cleaning up. And the Olympics has put in, this is insanity. And this is indicative of the fact that, listen, the term you want to use is that these people are idiots, morons, imbeciles, stupid, all this stuff. But the Bible does talk about these things, and it talks about, like in Romans chapter 1, and the Old Testament prophets talked about it too. My people they're idiots, they're stupid. And Romans 1 shows the progression, and also 1 Corinthians chapter 1, that they can be intellectually bright people, but they can't reason. They lose the ability to reason. And God gives them over. On the new cover of Rolling Stone, Your Honor, I submit to you Exhibit A and my evidence that Romans chapter 1 is in full operation in our society and culture. Look at this. I mean, we had this guy who admitted he was a liar, and he goes and he talks about Trump. And all these people, I believe him. She used to write speeches for Peggy Noonan, wrote speeches for Ronald Reagan, great writer. Says, I believe him. Kathleen Parker in the Washington Post, I believe him. Trump goes and gives a speech at C-SPAN in the context of all this. I'm going to play just a little clip of his speech and then the reaction on CNN. You have to watch this. Because this, well, you know what I want to say, so fill in the blank. This is whatever. Because I don't want any hate mail about it. These people can't reason. It's unbelievable. And whether you like Trump or not.
Heritage. We have people in Congress, right now, we have people in Congress that hate our country. And you know that. And we can name every one of them if they want. They hate our country.
Sam, the idea of preserving heritage taps into historically darker times. Certainly, not only that, though, you say what we heard from the president in those remarks also could pose a national security concern.
Well, his statement makes me sick. On a personal level, preserving our heritage, reclaiming our heritage, that sounds a lot like a certain leader that killed members of my family and about 6 million other Jews in the 1940s. But on a national security level, the president talks about preserving our heritage as a catch-all for implementing policies that misallocate resources. He pretends that there are massive flows of illegal immigrants coming over our borders and is spending billions of dollars on a border wall emergency instead of paying attention to real national security threats. He sounds a lot like despotic leaders that have talked about white heritage and white nationalism around the world and is putting resources in the wrong place and pretending that there are foreign people trying to influence our country in a way that just isn't accurate.
Who does that speak to?
It speaks to his base. And it also, by the way, this whole CPAC speech, how many parts of President Putin's to-do list was President Trump trying to accomplish today? He denigrated our institutions, the Department of Justice and the U.S. Congress. He spread misinformation and conspiracy theories. He undermined the credibility of several of our institutions. He sowed divisions. He sowed confusion. He was speaking to his base, but he was also saying things that really look like Vladimir Putin scripted his speech. So it helped him perhaps with his base and politically, while at the same time making Russia's job a lot easier.
Okay. She is, So they interviewed, the Rolling Stone cover, they interviewed people, and this is the inaugural clip, I think, that I've ever played. Maybe I played one other of hers. AOC and Nancy Pelosi. But I want you to listen to how AOC talks about it, and the question is, what would you tell President Trump? President Trump. Just like I called President Obama, it's President Trump. So here's what AOC and Nancy Pelosi have to say.
If I had to say something to Trump, I probably wouldn't say anything, because I don't think that it's worth the extra attention.
Mr. President, do the country a favor. Don't run.
Now listen. These women, it wasn't in the Senate, they're not in the Senate, but 44 Democrats refused to vote for a bill that says to amend Title 18 United States Code to prohibit a healthcare practitioner from failing to exercise the proper degree of care in the case of a child who survives an abortion or attempted abortion. 44 Democrats, including all the senators that are running for president, voted against that. Do not tell me that we do not live in the end times, that we don't live in the days of Noah and Lot, and that these people have lost the ability to reason. This is disturbing on an epic scale. Okay, so now we're going to shift. So that's just sort of the lead in. I can see you looking at your watches. And so let's rock and roll with the rest of these. Lot of things going on in the Middle East. There's a lot of turmoil in the area of Judea and Samaria. I like to call it Judea and Samaria because that's the biblical terms for it. People call it the West Bank. So if I slip up and say West Bank, you don't need to write and tell me that I don't know that it's Judea and Samaria, because I know that it's Judea and Samaria. I've actually been there. I've actually been in places, and I know the situation. I've been through the security checkpoints. I've been on the Palestinian roads. I've been on the Israeli roads. So I know what's going on. And I know the Palestinians were made up, okay? It was a KGB got the nephew of the Hajjaman al-Husseini, Yasser Arafat, and some others to create this Palestinian thing. It was a KGB operation all the way through. Robert Spencer has a great video up on YouTube. You can find that and look at it. So there's a lot of turmoil, though, in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank, because Hamas and Islamic Jihad, they want to get Abbas out of power. They want to take over, and they want to do to this West Bank area that they did to Gaza. When Israel left in 2005 under pressure from the United States and other European countries, they pulled out of Gaza, and now what do we have in Gaza? Big problems. So they want to extend that to Judea, Samaria. Now, what happened recently was there was a dispute. This was about a week ago Friday. Palestinians force open Temple Mount's Golden Gate. So here's an example of some of the Palestinians, burning Trump in effigy, pictures of Trump, no for the deal of the century, and we'll talk about Kushner going around. So let's give just a little, this has actually happened, by the way, in Hebron, which is, having been there, it is the most divided place you can ever imagine. I think Pam would agree with me on that. You have to see it to believe it. But the central part of Hebron, the central feature there is this Herodian structure built over the tomb of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their wives, Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah. It's Jewish property. They built a mosque on top of it, and they call the Jews the occupiers. It's insanity. So I'm going to give you a little bit. So we're going to talk about this Golden Gate thing, Gate of Mercy thing that's been going on, and the Palestinians and Arabs forcing their way in there, to try to put it in context, because the geography is very important. This is the Temple Mount, and just so you know, this is the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the southern end of the Temple Mount. This is to the north here. This is the Dome of the Rock. This is the Golden Gate, also called the Gate of Mercy. And this here is the Lion's Gate. You may remember seeing the Lion's Gate here in the lower right-hand corner in videos of the Israeli soldiers going in and taking back the Temple Mount in the Six-Day War in 1967, putting Jews in control of the Temple Mount for the first time in about 2,000 years. It was a stunning thing that happened. I've shared this. My father, who loved Bible prophecy, he was losing his mind, so to speak, because I can't believe it. And he talked about it for weeks on Wednesday night Bible studies and Sunday, and because he knew as a kid growing up that this was going to happen. It happened in my lifetime, and it happened in this 6-day war where they're attacked by everybody, and boom, it just happens. So that's the Lion's Gate. If you look all the way over here on the left to the east of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, by the way, this area in here is the Western Wall. And this is the Western Wall Plaza. This is the Jewish quarter of the Old City. But this area here is an area that was called Solomon's Stables. And there's some biblical things that if you study the temple, there's a great book, Messiah and the Temple. And when I say it's a heavy book, I don't mean just heavy intellectually. It's if you drop it on your foot, you will break your foot. Written by a Dutch gentleman, I can't remember his name right off the top of my head. But he talks about the fact that, Jesus was talking in this area of Solomon's stable, and they say they picked up stones to stone him with. Now, in the Temple Mount, you think they would keep it pretty clean, but there were stones there. And the tradition is, and I think there's some validity to this, that the stones that were there, that they picked up to stone Jesus. Why? Because he claimed himself to be God. They didn't mistake what he was saying. The stones were there because there was an incident that happened that prefigures the future abomination of desolation, where Antiochus Epiphanes went into and sacrificed a pig on the altar and desecrated the altar. Well, the altar had been dedicated to the Lord. It was the second temple altar. And they weren't allowed to just get rid of the stones. So they put them over in a section of the Temple Mount, sort of in this area over here. And the tradition was the Messiah will tell us what to do with these when he comes. Well, the Messiah came, and what did they want to do? They wanted to pick up those stones and stone him with those and kill him. Well, in this area, though, there's a thing called Solomon's Stables, and the Arabs, it's not really stables built by Solomon. That area to the south there, that was probably where David and Solomon had their palaces at the time of the first temple. But this is a very important area to the Arabs. There is a good, at the Begin Sadat Center Perspectives paper, Arab religiosity and support for the Palestinians. And this article talks about the fact that when you look at websites and that sort of thing, in the Arab world, as you get further away from Jerusalem, they're not that concerned about the Palestinian issue. The Palestinian issue is mostly a geography-centric thing. They care about it in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank. They care about it in Gaza, Jordan, Syria. But when you get over to Morocco, it's not that big a deal. It's a big deal to leftists in the world. Because why? Because leftists, well, they're wrong about most everything. But this article kind of lays this in perspective, and they say that this is really important because what you need to understand that in the Arab Muslim world, while there are differing degrees of support for the Palestinian problem, what is really going on in the Arab world is their concern about Al-Aqsa and the Holy Compound in Jerusalem. Now that has prophetic implications because this is sort of the epicenter of problems in the world. Everybody talks about it. What are we going to do? How are they going to do that? And so this article says, to understand the Middle East, you have to think in Arabic and take religion much more seriously than it is taken in the West. And so they're saying that in the Muslim world, what's going on in that Temple Mount, because there's a mosque there, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, actually more, as you'll see in a moment, that's why it's such a flashpoint and so important. Now, this is a great schematic that I found of the first temple. You see Solomon's buildings and there to the south, the city of David all the way at the end. It's always interesting too. There's a great video out by Aaron Lipkin about the footsteps of God. And what he does is he's gone and taken aerials of a lot of these archaeological sites throughout Judea and Samaria. And he's found that they're all pretty much in this shape. Now, when you really look at it, it looks like the imprint of a foot. Scripture says, every place you put your foot, I'll give it to you as your land. And then when they built the cities, they're in this shape. It seems a little bit, what's the old saying, coincidence is not a kosher word. But anyway, so that's what it looked like. So that that temple, this is built because they believed that the temple was where the Dome of the Rock, the Golden Dome, was. And so you can see this. Here it is looking from the Mount of Olives to the Temple Mount. Again, you see the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Dome of the Rock, and the Golden Gate right here. And you can't see the Lion's Gate, it's just off the photograph here. Here's yet another picture. This is kind of looking from the south to the north. And again, you see the Al-Aqsa Mosque and this. And then one more aerial shot of the Temple Mount looking from the west to the east towards the Mount of Olives. This is the Mount of Olives up here, which is really much higher than the Temple Mount, by the way. There's other hills in Jerusalem that are much higher than the Temple Mount. And here's the Western Wall right here in the Western Wall Plaza. So JCPA, Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, has put out a article called "Who is Breaking the Status Quo in the Temple Mount?" Because, as we said, the Arabs broke in there through the Gate of Mercy. What's going on? Who caused this? So again, here's the Lion Gates and the Gates of Mercy. Now the JCPA article, which you can find at jcpa.org, I think it's the lead article on the website right now, talks about sort of the history of how the Muslims have tried to claim the Temple Mount. And they bring up this picture. This is from back about 2000 to 2003. The Muslims went in, and you see the arches there. That would be at the southern end of the Temple Mount in this area right here. Now it looks very nice today, and you see these are ventilation and skylights. And what they did was they came in, they excavated, and as you can see, they've got dump trucks and bulldozers. They didn't excavate to protect whatever antiquities were laying under there, right? They just came in, scooped it up, and dug out this huge area, then covered it over and made it into a mosque. And today that mosque exists. It will accommodate, I've seen estimates of from 7,000 to 30,000 worshipers. And this is under the Temple Mount. So when you see this thing, this area right here, what is underneath that in the area of what they call Solomon's Stables is a mosque. And it's not just another mosque. So they have Al-Aqsa Mosque. They've really converted the Dome of the Rock, the Golden Dome, into a mosque. That's 2. Number 3 is they built this mosque. Number 4 is under the Al-Aqsa Mosque, they also excavated out a place, not being concerned with the antiquities that might be there, that might actually prove Jewish existence there in the First Temple period, even though the Waqf, the people in charge of the Temple Mount, issued a thing back in the 1920s that said, this is where Solomon's temple was. Now they run around saying, oh, no, there was never the Jews never had anything to do with this. They're lying, of course. So that's up to 4 mosques. So what is happening, and there's an article in Mosaic that talks about it, is that they went to this Gate of Mercy area that had been closed off since 2005 because of unrest. Their concern is, look, there's a peace plan coming. It's going to involve something. They see the Temple Institute. They're going to build a synagogue or something there. So we have to take it over. So there was this takeover. These are Israeli guards going into this area right near the Gate of Mercy, and they've essentially taken it over. You see the prayer rugs and everything that have been put there, and they've gone in there, and they've established a 5th mosque on the Temple Mount area. So this is what's going on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This gate of the Golden Gate, this one that you see that's closed up, and this is what it looks like if you excavate down, because this was built by Suleiman the Great around in the early 1500s, around around the time of the Reformation, 500 years ago. He built the wall around Jerusalem, but it was built on top of an older wall. This is what they do there. The city gets destroyed, and they build on top of the next one. So the Romans come in, they destroy the Temple Mount. People came back and built on top of it, and now this is the Golden Gate. And the theory is that it says the Messiah will come through this gate. So it's been open and closed, but the Muslims close it up. Why? Because they don't want the Messiah to come through there. They also put in front of the gate this whole area here and I've walked this path right along here. It's much flatter than it really is, by the way. This is a graveyard, a Muslim graveyard, because they don't believe that the Messiah would walk through a graveyard to go to the temple. That's why they did it. Geography is very important in these things that go on in the Middle East. So that's what's going on. That's a little bit of an explanation. Now, there's a really good article by Caroline Glick at Breitbart the other day. And it says exclusive. Well, no, this was about a month ago. I missed it. Former Israeli War College's commander says this: without Judea and Samaria, Israel cannot defend Tel Aviv. So this is Judea, this area, commonly called the West Bank. It's never been a nation of Palestine. After the partition in 1947, it was part of Jordan, which is east of the Jordan River. This is the Jordan River, and this is the West Bank of the Jordan River. It's a pretty big bank. This area here, this right here is about 10 miles. So that'll kind of give you an idea as to how big the bank, West Bank, is. And the interesting thing is, this writer, his name is Gershon Hacohen, Hacohen, and he gave an interview to Breitbart that Caroline wrote about, and she said this is a really, really important interview. And he wrote a paper for the Begin Sadat Center called "A Withdrawal from Area C of Judea and Samaria is an Existential Threat." Now, as you'll notice, this report is in Hebrew, and I spent a lot of time yesterday cutting and pasting 77 pages. Now, I didn't do all of them, but I did a pretty good chunk of them. Reading his report, because there's Google Translate, translate.google.com, is pretty good. I mean, if you have foreign language and you want to translate it, cut and paste the language there, the foreign language, and put it in there, and it'll say, oh, that's Hebrew, and it'll give you the English translation right away. It's really pretty cool. But this is a very important paper. It talks about the state of war and how things have changed, how war is not the same anymore. There's some interesting graphics in there. This is a graphic. Of course, this is Jerusalem right here. And this graphic has a very interesting title on it. Now, I'll spare you reading that in Hebrew, since I couldn't do it anyway. But this is what it says. Just think about this in terms of sort of its prophetic implications. The centrality of the open corridor between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea in deciding the future of Jerusalem. Now, we know in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, that Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So when you unpack what Jesus actually said, you can make some conclusions. One is there's going to be this event. Daniel wrote about it. So that kind of settles who wrote Daniel, right? Daniel wrote Daniel. Jesus thought Daniel wrote Daniel. So I'm going to go with Jesus. And he says, when you see this event, this abomination of desolation, take place, get out of town. Flee. In Judea and Samaria, you see this, leave, get out of there. And then he also says, pray that your flight not be on the Sabbath, or that you not be a mother who's nursing a child or pregnant at the time. And a lot of people say, well, that means he's only talking to Jews. He's talking to everybody in that area at the time, okay? I know this. It's actually more of a prophecy than you think. Because what's he talking about? Well, there's going to be a time in the future, and these disciples that heard this, a lot of them saw the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and they're thinking like, wait a minute, Jesus told us when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, that the temple's gone, Jerusalem is gone. We live in Europe, in the Roman Empire. But see, what Jesus said was much more of a prophecy than you think, because he was saying, there's a future time when the Jews are going to be in control of this area. Now, there's a lot of people that believe in a lot of people in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria that aren't Israeli or Jewish. But he said, pray that your flight not be on the Sabbath. Why? Have you ever been in Jerusalem and tried to get a bus or light rail on Shabbat, on Shabbat? Nothing operates. So he's saying, pray that this doesn't take place on Shabbat, because you won't be able to get a bus anywhere. So, and pregnant women and nursing women that would have trouble traveling, they're going to have trouble whether they're Jewish or Gentile, right? So that's why I don't think this passage is just to the Jews. And I know I will get a lot of hate mail over it, but go deal with the passage that says, you'll be persecuted for my name's sake. Unbelieving Jews are never persecuted for the sake of the name of Jesus Christ, okay? Deal with that passage. And I'm sure our friend Jacob will be here in a few weeks. We'll have some things to say about that. So anyway, there's also, this is Martin Sherman, who did a thing, and he shows that the security situation here. So he looks at this is what a Qassam rocket could do. This would be the range. So if you there's all these cities here along it, that if these were part of a Palestinian state, and it would be controlled by Hamas probably. So if you see, so this puts, a Katyusha rocket puts a lot of things, like a Qassam, which has a range of about 4 or 5 miles, could put Ben Gurion Airport in place, and a Katyusha could reach even further. So this is a very serious security situation. And so one of the things that they talk about in this is the change in how war is conducted. So I'll just read, this is going to be a little awkward because Google Translate is good, but Hebrew is written backwards, and so sometimes the thoughts don't flow the same way that they do when we talk. So here it says, privatization of war and its consequences. In recent decades, we have witnessed a steady decline in the number of interstate wars and a dramatic rise in the volume of internal wars and armed conflicts between states and extra-state organizations. For example, in 1999, 40% of the wars which occurred in the world were classified as internal wars directed against regimes, while 32% were classified as wars aimed at achieving autonomy or separation from a country. And essentially what he goes on to say is this war has changed, and weapons are now more readily available. And so non-state actors, like terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and that sort of thing, can wreak havoc. And it's changed the security equation and how people fight wars. It's not just an army with tanks and an air force with planes against another army with tanks and air force with planes. I mean, look at what ISIS was able to accomplish because they were really dedicated. And they didn't have an air force. They didn't really have tanks. And he talks about the fact that drones are now available. And GPS. Things that used to be only available to military, now everybody in the world can have them. And there are people flying drones all over Israel now, taking some pretty good pictures and photographs. And then you also have the internet, which you want to learn how to make something that's not a good thing, you can look it up on the internet and find all that information. So this is the area of the West Bank. The article also, or this paper that HaKohen wrote, also talks about the nature of the conflict that Israel would face if they gave up the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. And you can see this. This is this picture on the left here. This is old city of Nablus. And this is Balata, which is a refugee camp within the city of Nablus. In fact, if you go up on Mount Gerizim, where the Samaritans live, and you look down over here to your left, off the picture, you would have Shechem, biblical Shechem. Mount Ebal would be over here. This is Mount Gerizim that you're taking the picture from. And then this would be Balata. It is a very densely populated refugee camp. It's been there for 70 years. And they've built on top of each other. It's to go in there and to root out. And listen, when you drive down the street in Nablus, about every intersection is a square honoring a martyr who went and did a suicide bombing in Israel, like the Sbarro pizza place. And they have these huge murals painted of the guy based on a photograph taken smiling just before he left to go do the suicide bombing. And Nablus is a tough area. Israeli people are forbidden to go in there. Now, some do, and we were able to go in there, but this refugee camp has built up. This has been going on for 70 years. And I asked this guy from Gaza when I saw him at the Christ at the Checkpoint conference, I said, why are you still there? I mean, you know, you get outside of the refugee camp and you have fairly conventional apartment buildings and houses, but these people are like kept in this squalor. And this is probably what it started like. This is a refugee camp in Syria, and this is probably what it started like 70 years ago, but this is what it looks like today. And it's a problem. So there's a push, and this is a huge political issue in Israel in the upcoming election, where people, you know, there's a push, and there's a group of generals and former IDF commanders, and they've come out and they've said, listen, we have got to be, we've got to give up land. And so this is the big issue in the election. And it sort of relates to the peace plan. But I would recommend that you go and you get Caroline Glick's article at Breitbart. We'll have a link in the notes in the YouTube description, where she has this article. I want to read a little bit of those interview with General HaKohen. It says this: the world, and even Israel's left, continues to insist that the occupation hasn't ended. HaKohen says this: true, but they are wrong. Israel ended the occupation in 1996. It does not control the lives or the governance of the Palestinians. The Palestinians control their own lives and their own governance. Then he goes on to ask a question. The interviewer asks the question, what were the rest of Rabin's parameters? So his first parameter was, Rabin gave a speech about a month before he was assassinated in 1995 or 1996. And HaKohen says, Rabin's first principle was that Israel must remain a Jewish state with 80% Jewish majority. He began ensuring that in July 1994, when Israel withdrew from most of the Gaza Strip and set up the Palestinian Authority as an autonomous government responsible for the Palestinians. And then he goes on to ask, what were the other principles that Rabin talked about in his speech? His second premise was that, and so Rabin has been sort of maligned by history a little bit because he signed the Oslo Accords, but he had a pretty good understanding of what was going on. It was Shimon Peres that really pushed a lot of this bad stuff. So Rabin's second premise was that Jerusalem must remain under the sole Israeli sovereignty. Well, that sounds like something that a president of the United States has said, right? Rabin envisioned Jerusalem as being a much larger municipal area. Rabin understood that there is no military or practical way of dividing the city of Jerusalem. Yet what does the world want to do? Divide the city of Jerusalem. There is no man's land in Jerusalem that would serve as a natural boundary. Arabs and Jews live together. They cannot be separated, and any attempt to do so would produce a military and civilian catastrophe. Rabin's third premise was that Israel needs to control the Jordan Valley, broadly construed, in perpetuity. As he saw it, the Jordan Valley includes all the land along Israel's eastern frontier with Jordan and stretches into the eastern settlement band along the Sumerian mountain ridge in the north and the Judean hills in the south. Finally, Rabin said that the Palestinian entity would be formed and a final peace deal would be less than a state. Now, this is important because this interview from a month ago really sort of encapsulates the main issues that are going on in the Israeli election. I would highly recommend that you get it and read this article a couple of times because it will really increase your understanding. Because as I mentioned a week or two ago, there's a committee for Israel's security. It's made up of these former IDF commanders and generals, and they want to allow a Palestinian state to be created. And people on the right say, no Palestinian state. And then people in the middle are like, well, what's going to happen? Now, the United States, I will give Ted Cruz credit, he put in place, he introduced a bill, it was introduced a resolution, not a bill, well, maybe it is a bill. It's to set official U.S. policy. It was introduced in the Senate by Ted Cruz and the House by Mike Gallagher, I think his name's Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin. And it's to clarify that the United States policy is to recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. So it was, Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin, 8th District. So the bill has language in it. I'll just look at, here's a little bit. Israel's security from attacks from Syria and Lebanon cannot be assured without Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. In light of new realities on the ground, including Iran's presence in Syria, it is unrealistic to expect that the outcome of a peace agreement between Israel and Syria will be an Israeli withdrawal from the Golan Heights. It is realistic to expect that any peace agreement between Israel and Syria will only be achieved on the basis of Israel remaining on the Golan Heights. So I'm glad, grateful that there are people in our Congress that recognize this. So let's finish up with this. It was an interesting week in the Middle East, all centered large part around Syria and Trump's deal of the century, whatever this thing is going to be. Nobody knows for sure yet. And so there were meetings. The first meeting that took place was, and the Debka file has a good article that sort of summarizes the things that happened. You had Assad meeting with Khamenei in Tehran. First time that's happened in a long time. You had Kushner running around the Middle East, meeting with Mohammed bin Salman and President Erdogan of Turkey. And then you had, of course, Netanyahu and Putin meeting in Moscow. Now, this meeting between Assad and Khamenei, and also Rouhani, took place in Tehran. And this had not happened for years, ever since the Syrian civil war started in 2011. Now, what Debka reports, and I think this is accurate, was this meeting upset Vladimir Putin a little bit, because nobody called up Putin and said, hey, do you have any problems if Assad goes to Iran? And I think we'll see the result of that in just a moment. So Assad goes and he meets with Khamenei, and it's kind of interesting the way that the Iranian media and Khamenei's media people handled this, because this is from the video of the meeting. In fact, I don't know, is that... Hang on a second here. Okay, I thought I had the video actually of their meeting. Assad's a pretty tall guy. But when it ends up on Khomeini's Twitter or webpage, this is what it looks like. So this is Assad, and then this is, I think it's photoshopped. Just taking a wild guess. And these photographs, these are the photographs that are on Khomeini's webpage. Now it's interesting that there was another important person in the Iranian government. Rouhani was there, but there's another important person who was there that never showed up in the photographs, and that was General Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And the question is, why was he not there? Here's an editorial cartoon of the meeting between Assad and Khomeini. Now, there was one person who was not invited to the meeting. So Putin didn't know about it, and neither did Zarif, who's the foreign minister of Iran. And he, the word is, saw what happened at this meeting. He wasn't invited. He's in charge of foreign policy. Why wasn't I given an opportunity to be at this meeting with Assad? And he resigned. Now, the Iranian parliament and Khomeini and Rouhani have all rejected his resignation. So it's a little bit up in the air. There's another thing that's going on too, is there are these locust hordes that are feared to be descending on Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And in the Arab news, a Saudi paper the other day, they asked this question: what's 740 square kilometers in size, flies 400 kilometers a day, and eats more food than 25 camels? And I will tell you that the answer is not Jared Kushner's entourage that's running around the Middle East. I know that's what you're thinking, because he flies more than 400 kilometers a day. But his entourage, I do think, maybe eats more than 25 camels, more food than 25 camels. And so one of the things that was, the foreign minister resigned, and then there was also Kushner up here in the upper left-hand corner meeting with Erdogan, touring the Middle East to push the peace plan and his investment. He met with bin Salman. There were some reports that, nobody knows what's in this peace plan. There's a lot of speculation about it. There was an Arab newspaper that said they're not going to be a Palestinian state in the peace plan. But I think they misinterpreted what the quote was. The quote was actually in the New York Times. And here's what Jared Kushner actually said about the borders in this peace plan.
The political plan, which is very detailed, is really about establishing borders and resolving final status issues. But in order to, the goal of resolving these borders is really to eliminate the borders. And so if you can eliminate borders and have peace, less fear of terror, you could have freer flow of goods, freer flow of people, and that will create a lot more opportunity.
So there's going to be a lot of economic opportunity. So what happened? So Putin's not aware of the meeting, and between Assad and Khomeini, Kushner's running around, and then Netanyahu goes and meets with Vladimir Putin. I looked it up. That's really sort of the way you're supposed to say it. And there was a lot. What happened was that Putin really was very accommodating to Netanyahu. The thinking being that he was accommodating to Netanyahu because he was upset with the Iranians because they didn't tell him about the Assad visit to Tehran. And I think there's some validity to that. So it's all very much up in the air. I'm just telling you, there's a lot of things going on. There's tension between Russia and Iran over the Syrian thing. And Soleimani was there, and Zarif got upset, and he resigned, and then he was unresigned, and so just watch to see if he shows up anyplace anymore. Who knows what's going to happen? And there was some talk between Putin and Netanyahu that Russia is going to be more accommodating to Israel activity in Syria. And part of that is based on the fact that Putin is trying to punish Iran to a bit. And she said, you guys are out of line. I'm going to discipline you. So we'll see. We'll have to see how it happens. Now, one of the most important news this week, and this is sort of the parallel. We know Trump's under investigation. The Mueller report's coming out, but there's this indictment that isn't a formal indictment yet, as I understand it, issued against Netanyahu by the Attorney General of Israel. And it's on 3 charges: bribery, fraud, breach of trust. It is throwing the election into chaos. Netanyahu has fallen very far in the polls in just 2 days since this was announced, since it was announced on Thursday. There has to be a hearing. I think there's an immunity thing that is in place that he can't be charged until he's really no longer prime minister. There's a good article at Tablet Magazine, and I don't have time to go into it. You can look it up. It is called, title is What Bibi's Indictment Means by Avi Bell. What Bibi's Indictment Means by Avi Bell. And it just says the Attorney General's misguided decision to charge the Prime Minister with bribery and breach of trust may spell trouble for the future of Israeli democracy. I've looked at the charges. I think they're incredibly weak. They're politically motivated. And as Avi Bell, who is a lawyer and a professor in Israel, says, if this happens, and he quotes Alan Dershowitz, who said this, Alan Dershowitz correctly observes, the relationship between politics and the media and between politicians and publishers is too nuanced, subtle, and complex to be the subject to the heavy hand of criminal law. It's very undefined. It's very murky. It's not a bright line, like if you do this, you'll be charged. It was said that Netanyahu did things in office to get favorable media coverage, which means then that every politician in the world is a felon. So it's very troubling. It is totally politically motivated. The question that some people have had is when you get back to the peace plan that Kushner's trying to get in place, and they're supposed to announce after the Israeli elections, and there's people, Naftali Bennett has come out and said, release it now so we can vote on. We need to know what's in it. Let us know so we can make our people can make it an informed decision in the elections. And the concern, I think, is on some parts, and on some of the articles I read this week, is that the politicians on the left, which now seem to have the upper hand in forming the next government, and also whoever forms the next government will be prime minister, Gantz and Lapid have formed an alliance, the Blue-White Party. They may come out and say, hey, they may hear what it's about, figure out what the plan is, and they'll just say, we're going to accept it. In which case, there will be a sort of a referendum now on whether there'll be a Palestinian state. And as I showed you today, it would be disastrous for Israel for that to happen. But there are politicians on the left in the Blue and White Party that want this to happen. So that Israeli politics, American politics are very much parallel. Investigations going against the prime minister or president, and extreme division that's taking place. So that's let's see. I think that's enough. Well, Britain outlawed Hezbollah. That was good news this week. And people are leaving the Labour Party over anti-Semitism. But there's anti-Semitism growing all over Europe. And it's very troubling. It's also prophetic. So that's sort of a summary of where everything is. So you can see how there's sort of parallels between what's going on in Israel and in the United States, who's the biggest supporter of Israel in the world. And you also, I think, got a sense of some of the geography that's involved in these situations. And the Temple Mount is very, very important in the Muslim world. And they're going in there, they're creating another mosque. And when they conquer land, they say that they never have to give it back. So this is because they're afraid of what the Kushner plan is going to be. And they're trying to get out ahead of that. So let's pray, And we'll kind of watch to see what happens this week. Father, thanks so much for your word, Lord. I just pray that you will help us to give us wisdom as we try to follow the events that are going on. Bless us this week. Pray that you'll give us opportunities to share the blessed gospel of Jesus Christ with those around us. And that just pray that you'll give us those opportunities, Lord. Bless us this week. In Jesus' name, amen.